You know, the great Dan Curtis directed some of the best gothic horror of the late 60s, early 70s, including Kolchak the Night Stalker with Darren McGavin, and of course the Dark Shadows oeuvre, as well as the two movies were the inspiration. But one of these projects that should have got a series run but never did is something called the Norliss tapes. Now, this is a 73 American made-for-TV horror film directed by Dan Curtis and written by William F. Nolan. It starred Roy Fiennes of Invaders fame and of course the great Angie Dickinson. Framed through a series of tapes left behind by the missing Norliss, an investigator of the occult, that tells the story of his encounter with a widow and her artist husband who has returned from the dead. It was originally produced by NBC as a pilot for a series which never came about, which is kind of shocking because it seemed to be of the time, as we say, 72 minutes. It did premiere as a standalone movie on the NBC network on February 21st, 73, which around the same time that Night Gallery was starting to fade out on the NBC network. Years later, it acquired a modest cult following on the independent theater circuit, including Boston, New York, LA, and New York City. Now, in the movie, David Norliss, a writer working on a book debunking spiritualists and fakers, vanishes from his home in San Francisco, leaving behind a series of audio tapes explaining his absence and recent investigations. The narrative unfolds as a friend, his publisher Sanford Evans, listens to the first of the tapes. Now, Norliss has recently investigated an incident reporting by Ellen Court, a widow who claims that she was attacked by her recently deceased husband James one night under a estate near Monterey. Her husband, who had been suffering from a crippling disease, became involved in the occult after meeting a mysterious woman, Mademoiselle Jekyll, Jekyll, or Jackal, who attended one of his art exhibitions. Court says James was buried with a mysterious scarab ring that Jekyll gave him. That evening in Carmel, a young woman is attacked in her car, causing her to crash and die. When she is found, her skin is a dark gray, and a coroner later confirms her body was drained of blood. Norliss travels to Carmel to meet Sheriff Tom Hartley, played by Claude Akins, to discuss Ellen's claims. Later, Norliss and Ellen visit James' crypt on the estate and find a ring in his hand. Norliss goes to San Fran to meet Charles Langdon, the gallery owner, who had called Ellen inquiring about purchasing James's ring. Langdon learns that the ring was buried with James and tries to steal it, but the coffin is empty. As he leaves the crypt, he is attacked by the ghoul, James. Norliss meets Jekyll, who warns him to stay away from the Court estate. That night, Norliss and Ellen investigated James' art studio, where they find a large sculpture Ellen says was not there days before. The ghoul James attacks them. Norliss shoots him several times, of course, doesn't kill him, but James chases him out of the studio. James rips off the door of their car as they drive away. Sheriff Hartley joins Norliss and Ellen, and they find James's crypt empty. Ellen's sister, Marcia, arrives at the Court estate, hoping to spend the night. When she finds nobody home, she instead lodges at a nearby motel. James eventually breaks into the room and carries her into the nearby woods. Now, Norliss research discovers a series of tunnels had been built on the Court estate in its construction in the 1920s. Lab results on clay from the large sculpture show includes human blood. I think at one point it was 40% on the level. Jekyll arrives unannounced and tells Ellen that James made a pact with the Egyptian deity Sargoth to create a sculpture through which Sargoth could enter the world in exchange for immortality. Jekyll says that to stop James, his scarab ring must be removed. Now, Ellen and Jekyll search the tunnels for James and find him resting inside a pine box coffin. Good place for a vampire, not a good place for a ghoul. Jekyll attempts to remove the ring, but James awakens and bites her neck. Fleeing through the tunnels, Ellen stumbles upon Langdon and Marcia's corpses. Norliss finds Ellen in the tunnels, and they emerge in James's art studio. Norliss and Ellen watch as James summons Sargoth, bringing the statue to life. Norliss, however, is able to destroy them by burning the studio, a la House of Wax, Vincent Price, in a manner that Jekyll had specified. Evans finished listening to the tape and wonders if Norliss' disappearance is related to the incident described on it. He begins to play another tape, which documents a second event. So, the way it was going to work with the pilot and the episodes, the person who's listening to the tape is going to try to track down Norliss, and it would have been quite interesting how this was going to play out. Now again, Roy Fiennes as Norliss, Angie Dickinson as Ellen Stemscourt, Don Porter as Sanford T. Evans, Claude Akins as Sheriff Tom Hartley, Michelle Carey as Marcia Stearns, Vonetta McGee as Mademoiselle Jekyll, Herb Hatfield as Charles Langdon, Brian O'Byrne as Mr. Dopkins, Robert Mandan from Soap fame as George Rosen, El Gilbert, not the hockey player, of course, as Sid Phelps. Jan Dulo as Sarah Dobbins. Stanley Adams as truck driver. Bob Shaw as Sargoth in a late performance. George Costanza as Man in Langdon Gallery. Patrick White as Larry Mather, and Nick Dimitri as James Court. Now, originally written under the working title Demon, the Norliss tapes, could have been interesting, was adapted from a story by Fred Bustard Stewart, and writer William Nolan said he took Stewart's basic premise of a Walking Dead man and adapted it into a teleplay that was mostly made up his own ideas. Again, the pilot was shot on location in San Francisco and Monterey. Now, it premiered on February 21st, 1973, but only came out on DVD on Anchor Bay in 2006. The DVD, now out of print, is available through various purchase sites, featured theatrical trailers as well as bonus material. In the 2000s, the film underwent a brief revival yet again at a cult movie circuit, with theatrical screenings in such locations as Toronto, New York, and LA, sometimes as part of the Dark Shadows big screen movies. Variety gave a positive review, said Curtis directed the film with eye to tension and that he manages. The idea behind Nolan's script has validity with its open dependency on the supernatural. The basic thrust to scare is what counts, and there Nolan, Curtis, Steins, and company succeed. Hollywood Reporter and TV Guide also give it positive reviews. Reporter called it a lot of fun with a new twist in the old vampire story, and TV Guide called it a creepy, harmlessly shot boogeyman tale that holds up surprisingly well. Now, if you can find it, like I said, it'll be probably $30–40 range, but there was talk many years ago, I know, Night of Dark Shadows and House of Dark Shadows is available on single DVDs, but I wouldn't be surprised down the road with the anniversary of this movie, which is coming up to 50th anniversary, you would see probably a combination of both. Or I saw it once in French, and it really stood out. It looked more like a big screen movie, but really stood out for a lot of us. What the heck was Angie Dickinson doing in such a project where she was a big screen movie star and was about to enter policewoman and future success? So not saying she was slumming, but Roy Fiennes, he could do soap operas, he could do science fiction, he could do anything. Probably one of the most underrated actors of all time. The only confusion that we had back in the day was how to pronounce his last name. We pronounce in Canada Fiennes. Some people pronounce it Thinez or Thins, but no matter what you call him, a tremendous actor and comparable to Darren McGavin in regarding what we call the soft handsomeness that's needed in science fiction movies. If you're having a leading man in science fiction, you can't have him overcome the script with your looks. You got to be a 3 out of 4. And boys, oh boys, like I said, there should be a Dan Curtis museum someplace, because all the great stuff he did, even the non-gothic stuff, War and Remembrance and the different movies, he's done a lot of great stuff. And always you hear of a Dan Curtis production, it's still talked about, 56 years later. He's what he called the poor man Spielberg, in my opinion, and deserves recognition as one of the persons that should have been a showrunner for Night Gallery, but Jack Laird should have brought him in. His big mistake. It would have been, if it had been on in 4 or 5 years, you could just call it Dan Curtis's Night Gallery if it was called Rod Serling's Night Gallery. So, but anyway, he could direct, he could write, he could do all kind of different stuff. He's a tremendous artist for the horror genre. And what would the world be like without people like Dan Curtis? I hate to think. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's my late Halloween review of the Norliss tapes. If you like what we're doing here, give us a like, a comment, subscribe. Don't forget, like I said, Dan Curtis, check out his oeuvre. Even War and Remembrance, the miniseries is quite interesting. They call that the Dan Curtis style. Thanks for listening. Bye.